Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we are going to be preserving lots of pears. As you can see behind me here, I got a nice big box of organic pears. There's about 20 pounds of organic pears in this box, and we are going to be preserving them up in lots of different ways. I'm going to be making 2 different recipes of pear butter, and we're going to be comparing them. I don't really have a go-to recipe with pear butter because I've never made it before. I made apple butter, but I haven't tried it with pears. So we're going to be trying 2 recipes, and then we're going to be canning those up. And we're going to be trying another experiment, which is pear scrap vinegar. You can see here, this is my apple scrap vinegar, which is in the process of fermenting. I made a bunch of applesauce a few days ago and saved my apple scraps to make apple scrap vinegar. So we're going to experiment and try the same thing with pears and see how that works. We're also going to be turning some of these pears into fruit leather. I think I'm going to combine them with blueberries or raspberries. I'm going to go through my freezer and see what looks good to combine these with. Maybe we'll do a little bit of both. And then whatever we have left, we're going to be slicing up and freezing. I'm going to be trying a new technique to prevent browning on the pears. So we've got a fun afternoon ahead of us lined up. The first thing I'm going to be prepping is my pear butter. So I'm going to be collecting the peels and the cores and putting them in here for the vinegar. And then as I slice up the pears, I'll be putting them into this big stock pot here for our first recipe of pear butter. So I'm just gonna pull a few pears out at a time to work with and stick them on my cutting board, and then I'm gonna move this box out of our way. So the first pear butter recipe that we're going to try is from my favorite canning book right here. This is the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. If you're interested in canning, whether you have a lot of experience or not, I do recommend this book. This is a great book, especially if you're getting started, but it has lots of good recipes, even if you already have some experience. So for our first recipe, we're going to need 7 pounds of pears. So I'm going to go ahead and measure out 7 pounds of pears, and then we'll get those all peeled up. All right, here we go. This is just over 7 pounds of pears, so that should be perfect for our pear butter. Okay, so as I peel these pears, I'm just gonna go ahead and drop all the peels into this half-gallon mason jar that I have set up with a canning funnel, and then we're going to slice up the flesh of the pear, and we're going to put it right into this big stock pot here. And this is where we're going to make our pear butter. These pears are nice and ripe, and they are peeling so easily. This is so much easier. A couple days ago, I peeled 12 pounds of apples to make applesauce, and that took forever. I'm planning to get one of those crank peelers that you put on your countertop, and they kind of peel and core and slice all in one motion. I definitely want one of those, but for now, I don't have one yet, and I'm appreciating the ease with which these pears are peeling. So let's drop that into our jar. And we'll get this one all sliced up. I'm also putting the core in this jar. I don't remember if I said that or not. So I'm basically just quartering the pears, cutting the core out, and then putting the rest of the pear into this pan here. All right, so we've got all of our pears peeled, cored, and roughly chopped. So in this front pot here, we have our 7 pounds of pears. That's for the pear butter recipe from the Ball Preserving book. And in this back pan here, we've got 6 pounds of pears. So the 6 pounds of pears go with a recipe that I found online for brown sugar pear butter that looks really good. So I'm doubling that recipe. It actually called for 3 pounds of pears. So we're going to try both of these pear butter recipes, and I'm going to let you know which one I like better. So let's get started by adding half a cup of water to each of these pans of pears. So this pan in the back here, I'm just gonna turn on the heat, and we're just gonna bring that to a simmer and just let that be. And then this pan in the front here, we're going to go ahead and zest a whole lemon in here and then juice the lemon in here as well. We're gonna get both of these started cooking over like probably a medium-low type of heat. So now that we've got all the ingredients that we need in our pear butter to really get it cooking, I'm going to give them both a stir. I'm going to turn up the heat a little bit to bring them to a boil, and then I'm going to turn the heat down to a simmer and let them simmer for a little bit. So now that our pear butter is off to a good start and it's just got to cook a little bit, we're going to go ahead and do the next steps with our pear scrap vinegar. I filled this pretty full. I actually did not have space for all of the peels, so I went ahead and reserved a few peels. So I went ahead and reserved some peels here as a little treat for my chickens. They really love big preserving days like this because then they get lots of extra delicious treats. So to our pear scrap vinegar here, we are going to start by adding a 1/4 cup of sugar. And then we're going to add enough water to make sure that all of these pear peels and cores stay submerged. We want to have this all below the surface of the water to prevent mold and so that all of the beneficial bacteria and yeast on these pear peels can start to ferment and turn that water into vinegar. All right, now we just want to go ahead and give this a stir. And then we are going to cover this with a coffee filter. We want it to be covered just to prevent contamination from anything getting into it, but we don't want it to be airtight because it needs to be able to breathe. Now I'm just going to set this aside out of direct sunlight, but I'm going to leave it out on the counter so that I will remember to stir this every day. You want to make sure when you're making a vinegar like this that you stir it every day because that's going to make sure that all of these, in this case pear scraps, stay submerged and prevent mold and prevent spoilage. So I'm guessing this will probably take about 30 days or so. Some people add another 1/4 cup of sugar a few days in. I'm just going to kind of see how much activity there is in here, and if I feel like I need to add another 1/4 cup of sugar, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then after that, I'm going to let it sit for about 30 days or so and strain all this out. And I'm going to keep you updated and let you know how this goes because, as I said, I've never made pear scrap vinegar. This is a bit of an experiment. So both of our pans of pear butter have come up to a simmer. So I'm going to let both of those simmer for about 20 minutes or so just to really soften and cook the pears. So then we're going to mash them up and not quite puree them, but we're going to blend them up a little bit. We're going to add the sugar and other ingredients, and then they'll keep cooking down. So let's go ahead and prep some of our pears for freezing. So how you prepare pears for freezing really depends on what you plan to do with them when they're thawed. In my case, I am planning to use these mostly for smoothies or for flavoring my water kefir with. And so because those are my intended uses for these pears, I don't need to worry about peeling them. So I'm just going to quarter them, just to core them easily, and then I'm going to slice them up. I'm going to leave the peel on. If you are planning to use these in baked goods, you probably are going to want to remove the peel. So it just completely depends on your purpose for them. The peel does have a lot of fiber and a lot of the nutrition of the pear, so it makes sense since I'm planning to use them for smoothies and things like that. It makes sense for me to leave the peel on. Plus, it's less work for me. So what we are going to do though, is we are going to treat our pears to prevent them from browning while they're frozen. This is going to be kind of an experiment for me. I've never frozen pears like this before, but I'm going to try it out and I'll let you know how it works. Now again, because of my intended uses for these pears, I probably don't really have to worry about browning because if they're going in smoothies or water kefir, it doesn't really matter if they're brown. But I'm going to treat them anyway, mostly because I'm curious how this works. So what we are going to do, before we freeze our pears, in this bowl here, I'm going to put a quart of water and 1/2 tablespoon of salt. I'm going to just slice up my pears and then I'm going to soak all the pear slices in this bowl of salt water before freezing them. And then once they've soaked, I'm going to rinse them off. Then I'm just going to lay them out on this cookie sheet flat to freeze. That's just going to prevent them from sticking together. If you don't care if they stick together, if you're going to be defrosting a whole bag before using them, you can just pack them in a freezer safe bag together because I want to be able to take out a small amount if I need to. I'm going to freeze them individually, and then once they're frozen solid, I'm going to take them out and put them in a bag. So let's get started preparing our salt water for our pears, and then we're going to prep our pears. All right, so in goes our quart of water. Now I'm just going to measure out a 1/2 tablespoon of salt. And just whisk that in. Now people say as long as you rinse the salt water off of your pears before freezing, you should not taste any salt on them once they're defrosted. I'm going to test this out, and later in the season when I defrost these pears and use them, I'm going to let you know how true that is. But for now, let's just give it a try. Okay, these pears should be really quick to prep since we're not peeling them, so let's go ahead and get them cut up and into our bowl. So I'm just gonna cut them about like this, put them right in the salt water. All right, so we've got our first batch of pears for freezing, soaking in our salt water. I'm just gonna let those soak for a couple of minutes because our pear butter has been cooking for 20 minutes now. So you can see it's really soupy. It's definitely still got chunks, but it's a lot of liquid that's been released from the pears. So what I'm going to do is I'm just gonna give these a quick mash with a potato masher. Then I'm just gonna pull out my immersion blender and blend it until it's nice and smooth, and then we will get the rest of our ingredients added. I'm just giving a little mash to make things a little easier on my immersion blender so it doesn't have to do quite as much work. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and mash up the other pot as well. This one in the back's a little bit firmer. I think that might need a couple more minutes, probably mainly because it's a smaller pot. It does have a smaller amount of pears, but they're still a little more crowded in that pot than they are in the big one in the front. So I'll turn the heat back up on that back one and let it cook for a couple more minutes while we get our immersion blender and blend up this front pot. So if you don't have an immersion blender like this, you could definitely ladle this out into a food processor and do it that way. You could run it through a food mill. Those are great options. I like using the immersion blender because I can just leave everything in the pot. I don't have to scoop it out at all. So for today, that's what I'm going to use. So there we go, all blended up. As you can see, this kind of looks like applesauce. So we're gonna let this one be, and I'm going to go ahead and blend up the back one. Just give this one a little bit more of a mash before we blend it. So an immersion blender is definitely one of those extra tools that's not really a necessity in the kitchen, but it does make certain things a lot easier. And my immersion blender is actually really cheap. This isn't a high quality, I mean, it's worked well for me. I shouldn't say it's not high quality. It's not like a high end, really fancy one. I got this just on a Black Friday deal. I think it was like $12 or something. So it's not a big investment, and I really do enjoy using it. So to this front pot, the larger pot, the one that we are making the recipe from the ball preserving book, we are going to need to add 4 cups of granulated sugar. That is a lot of sugar. But remember, this is not pear sauce, like an applesauce. This is pear butter. So that's going to be kind of more like, you can kind of compare it to like a jam or something that's going to be really sweet and not something that you would eat on its own. It's kind of more a condiment, at least in my opinion. So that's how I justify the large amount of sugar. So we're gonna go ahead and add 4 cups of sugar to this and 1 teaspoon of nutmeg. So I do, when I'm making a recipe that has a lot of sugar, I kind of usually skimp a little bit by just not filling my cup of sugar up all the way. So 4 cups of sugar goes right in here. Oh, I just broke my measuring cup. Look at that. All right, that's our last cup of sugar in that one. Now we're also going to need a teaspoon of nutmeg. Now I'm gonna say I am not the biggest fan of nutmeg, and this is actually the reason why I decided to try a second recipe as well, because this has a whole teaspoon of nutmeg in it. Now granted, this is a lot of pear butter. This is supposed to make 8 cups of pear butter, so like 8 little half-pint jars. But still, I tend to only like nutmeg in very small amounts. I'm going to give this a try as written and see how it is. But I have my other pear butter recipe as well that has a much smaller amount of nutmeg. So we'll compare and see just which one we like better. All right, so let's go ahead and add our teaspoon of nutmeg. I'm gonna go ahead and get this stirred up so that it can start incorporating. Now to this pear butter, we are also going to add the zest and the juice from 1 orange. So I have an organic orange here. Whenever I have a fruit that I'm using, whenever I have a citrus fruit that I'm using the zest from as well, I prefer to get organic because the peel is where most of the pesticides would be concentrated. So this is the same measuring container that we juiced our lemon in. Since that was in the same recipe, I'm just gonna go ahead and not wash my zester or my cup. We're just going to zest the orange right in there and then juice it right in there too. Then we'll get all of this added right into our pear butter. Now, zesting a fresh orange makes it smell amazing. It smells so good right now. I'm looking forward to this pear butter simmering and just really perfuming my house, making it smell like fall. So I'm making sure when I zest my orange, I'm taking all of the outer orange, but I'm not taking any of the white part, because when you take the white part, that's when it starts to get really bitter. It's even more true when you're working with lemons. So that's why I like to use a little microplane zester like this instead of an actual grater. I find when I use an actual grater, I'm more likely to get some of that white part that I don't really want in a recipe like this. All right, so there's our zest. I'm just going to juice our orange right into this same container. I like to use a strainer just to catch any seeds. And I find if you roll out your citrus fruit before juicing it, it makes it a lot easier to juice. Go ahead and add our orange juice and zest right in. All right, let's stir that up. I see a couple little chunks of pear in there that we missed with our immersion blender, but that's okay. It'll just add to the character. I think it'll still be delicious. And it still has to cook for quite a while, so it'll break down even a little more as it cooks. It smells so good. So for our brown sugar pear butter, we're now going to add about 3 cups of brown sugar to our pear butter. So I'm gonna see, this is homemade brown sugar that I have in here. I have a half cup, so I'm gonna need 6 of them. I don't know if I'm going to have quite enough in here, so I'll either have to make some more or else I will have to use a little bit of store-bought brown sugar as well. But let's go ahead and add what we have and see how much more we need. So that was about 2.5 cups of the homemade brown sugar that we added. I do have a little bit of store-bought, so I'm going to go ahead and use that for the last half cup. But as a side note here, if you have never made your own homemade brown sugar, definitely try it. It is so easy. I have a video where I show how I made this brown sugar. I'm gonna go ahead and link that in the video description. So if you're interested in making your own brown sugar, it's pretty much the easiest thing you can imagine. But for right now, I'm not going to make it right this moment because I have a lot of other stuff going on. I'm going to get some store-bought brown sugar for that last little half cup. All right, so I've made a mess all over my counter. Let's add our last half cup of brown sugar and get that all mixed in. So also to our brown sugar pear butter, we're gonna add half a teaspoon each of cinnamon and nutmeg and 1/4 teaspoon each of allspice and ground cloves. So I don't know if you can see in the back there, this pear butter does have a few lumps as well, but that's okay. We're going to be fine with that. So 1/2 teaspoon nutmeg. And then 1/4 teaspoon both ground cloves and ground allspice. So this is just gonna smell like fall while it simmers. All right, let's give that another stir. So the last ingredient that we want to put into our brown sugar pear butter is either part of a vanilla bean or vanilla extract. Now I'm going to use part of a vanilla bean in there. The recipe actually calls for half a vanilla bean. So you would think, since I'm doubling it, I would put a whole vanilla bean, but I'm going to show you the size of these monster vanilla beans that I have in this extract, and then you'll understand why I'm not using a whole one. Incidentally, I do have some new vanilla beans coming in the mail. They're pre-ordered, they're way out there. They're probably coming sometime in December or January. So when they come in, I'm going to make a video showing you how I make this vanilla extract. But basically for right now, what I'm going to say is that I buy more vanilla beans than I need to make this amount of vanilla extract, and then I store them all in the jar because the alcohol is going to preserve them. It will extract some of their flavor, but there will still be plenty of flavor left if you want to use it in another recipe, and that alcohol will preserve it while you're waiting to use it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out these vanilla beans. I'm going to take out a vanilla bean. I'll show you how big it is. And then I think we'll end up using probably half of one because these are at least twice the size of normal vanilla beans. So as long as you don't split your vanilla beans when you put them into vanilla extract, you can still use them in other recipes. A lot of people split their vanilla beans, which is fine. It does make your extract faster. But so see, look at the size of this bean. It's nice and plump and long. This is a really good vanilla bean. So you can see that this is not split. This is a whole vanilla bean. When you split your vanilla bean, it makes it extract faster and does give you a little bit of a richer extract. But since I have so many beans in here, I like to keep some of them whole so that I can use them in other recipes. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this vanilla bean in half. We're going to put half of it back into our extract to finish extracting. And then I'm now going to split this lengthwise and simmer it along with my brown sugar pear butter. So I'm just going to show you, look at the vanilla bean caviar there. If you store your vanilla beans in your vanilla extract and you need vanilla caviar for something, you can snip one open and just kind of squeeze the caviar out into a recipe. I don't know if you can see that coming out there. So now that's another thing you can do too. I don't know if you can see the caviar coming out of this bean here, but if you store it in your vanilla extract uncut, this caviar is then still good for other recipes and you can use it. You can see that dark caviar down there. Contrary to what a lot of people think, the majority of the vanilla flavor is actually in the bean and not the caviar, but we do want both. So I'm just gonna go ahead and split this bean open. That way we'll get the rest of the vanilla bean caviar in our pear butter, and we will also get the flavor of the vanilla bean pod infusing into our pear butter. So here, you can see I already squeezed out most of the caviar, but you can see that there is still some goodness in there and some of it's coming off on my fingers. Don't want to waste any of that goodness. Now, if you want to make this recipe and you don't have fresh vanilla beans, you could definitely use vanilla extract instead. I figured since I had some and I'm kind of going all out on this recipe, I might as well really go all out and use some nice fresh vanilla for that extra gourmet flavor. So now that our pear butters are both cooking away, we're going to go ahead and rinse these pears that have been soaking in the salt water, and then we're going to lay them out on our cookie sheet that I've lined with a silicone baking mat. That way we can get the first batch of pears freezing. All right, so that was just about the perfect amount of pears for this cookie sheet. So we're going to go ahead and get this frozen in the freezer. You know what, I'm gonna eat one right now and I'm gonna see if it tastes salty. It doesn't really taste salty to me. So I'm gonna say that this is a good preservation method as far as flavor. We'll see how it does as far as preventing browning on our fruit. So our pear butter is almost done. It's almost ready to be canned. It's been simmering actually for a couple hours. Fruit butters kind of take a long time simmering at a low temperature. But while that's finishing up, we're going to get started on our fruit leather. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make pear raspberry fruit leather. So let's go on over to the blender and I'm going to show you how we're going to combine them. So first into our blender, we're going to put 2 cups of water. Now that might seem kind of counterintuitive since we're going to be dehydrating something, but the water is really just going to help all of the ingredients really incorporate and blend smoothly. Then we're going to cook it on the stovetop a little bit and then put it in the dehydrator to actually turn into leather. So let's go ahead and add our 2 cups of water to our blender. Now I also have a cup of raspberries that I defrosted. This doesn't look like quite a cup anymore because they've kind of condensed as they've defrosted, but this was a cup. So I'm going to put this into the blender along with our water. Now I have down here on the counter 8 pears. I'm just going to peel these, give them a little bit of a chop, and put them in the blender along with our water and raspberries. Okay, so we've got all of our fruit ingredients in the blender ready to go. The next thing we're going to need is a 1/4 cup of honey. Now this is partly for sweetness, but it also does really work to make the leather a little more flexible and less brittle, which is the reason why I like to include it. My recipe book, here, I'll show you the book I'm using. This is the book I'm using here. Now, I don't always follow and like every recipe in this book, but I do like the recipes for the fruit leathers that are in here. So The recipe actually calls for corn syrup. I do not want to use corn syrup in my fruit leather, so I'm using honey instead. I'm using this as opposed to a granulated sugar because this will really help it to stay a little more flexible. So we're going to measure out a 1/4 cup of honey and add that in. I am actually doubling this fruit leather recipe. If you have this book or get this book, you'll see that's why I am. It actually calls for 2 tablespoons of corn syrup. We're using a 1/4 cup of honey in a doubled recipe. So now we are going to need 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. This kind of balances out the sweetness of the honey and also kind of prevents discoloration with the fruit. I've got a giant 2 tablespoon measurer here. So we're going to measure out 2 tablespoons of lemon juice and right into the blender that goes. Now every time I've made fruit leather, I have at least somewhat followed the recipe in this book. This book calls for cornstarch. It says that that prevents cracking in the fruit leather. I will say I have not tried fruit leather without cornstarch because I've only made it according to this book. But this would be an ingredient that I would be okay leaving out. So if you have made fruit leather without cornstarch, let me know. How was the texture? Did it crack? Did it not crack? We're going to go ahead and add this according to the book, but I would be curious at some point to maybe try this without this ingredient. So the book calls for a teaspoon per recipe. We're doubling it, so we'll do 2 teaspoons of cornstarch in here. All right, and that is all of our ingredients. So let's go ahead and get this blended up. So we're gonna blend this until it's smooth and kind of looks like applesauce. So that looks pretty smooth in there. So I'm gonna say that that is ready. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this to the side. So we're gonna go ahead and jar up our pear butter and get that processing before we proceed with fruit leather. I think our pear butter is done. And that will free up some space on our stove top because we do need to boil this fruit leather for a couple minutes before we actually put it in the dehydrator. So let's take a look at our pear butter. I'm going to show you how it looks now, and then we're going to get started canning that. So look at how nice and thick this is. This looks really good. You can see it's cooked down a lot since we first started cooking it, and this is ready to jar up. Now the one in the back, I'm gonna bring that forward so you can see it. So here's our brown sugar pear butter. You can see how nice and dark and rich that got. These both look really good. Over here I have my stock pot of water getting ready to can. This is hot, but I'm going to turn it up a little bit because I want it to be pretty close to boiling when we actually put our jars in. So for our light colored pear butter, the recipe says that it will make either 8 half-pint jars or 4-pint jars. I have 6 half-pint jars and I have 1 pint jar that I have ready for this. I'm not sure if it's going to make quite that much. I may have cooked it down a little more than the recipe called for, but we'll find out. The other recipe, the brown sugar one, says that it will make 3 half-pint jars. We doubled it, so it should be 6 half-pint jars. So we'll see what we get. So I'm going to go ahead and use my handy little jar lifter. I'm going to get the jars out of this hot water here and set up over here, and then we'll start filling them. All right, so I got all our jars filled with the lighter pear butter. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe the rims of all the jars with a damp paper towel. That's going to make sure that there isn't any food on the jars that gets stuck in the seal and interferes with the jar sealing properly. So at this point, if you haven't already checked your jars for cracks or just little chips, you want to go ahead and do that because that's something else that can interfere with your jars sealing properly. So these jars all look good. So I'm going to go ahead and get the lids on these, get them in the canner, and then we will jar up our brown sugar pear butter. So all of our pear butter processed in the canner for 10 minutes. Then I took the lid off, turned the heat off, and let it sit for 5 minutes. So now it's time to take all these jars out and let them cool. So we're just going to take all the jars out of the canner with our little jar lifter and put them onto this towel to cool. And then we don't want to really touch or move them for 24 hours. They should seal pretty quickly, but as always, if there are any that don't seal, you can just stick those in your fridge and just use them as if they were an open product. And I'm already hearing them seal, so that's a good sign. They say it can take up to 24 hours for them to seal, but in my experience, it usually happens within the first, I don't know, a couple minutes to the first hour. And usually if it doesn't happen then, in my experience, it doesn't happen. But you never know. I'd give it the 24 hours to be safe. So there we go, 13 jars of delicious pear butter. All right, so now that we're done with our canning project, let's continue on with our fruit leather. We're just gonna pour it into this saucepan. We're gonna bring it up to a boil, then we're gonna reduce the heat so that it simmers for 2 minutes. So our fruit leather simmered for 2 minutes. I've let it cool a little bit. It's not all the way cool to room temperature, but it's cooled down a little bit. So now we're going to load up our dehydrator trays and get it dehydrating. Now I have these really cool inserts that go in my dehydrator trays. These are made specifically for fruit leather and other things like that. If you don't have these, you could make your own out of parchment paper. I have one here that I made out of parchment paper. I don't think that the 3 fruit leather trays that I have will be enough for this batch. So I made a 4th out of parchment paper, and I may need to make another one, we'll see. So this recipe calls for scooping out 1 cup of fruit leather for each tray. I find that that makes it a little bit thinner than we like, so I like to do 1.5 cups per tray. So I'm gonna go ahead and load up all the trays that I have. We'll see if we need to make more parchment paper, and then we'll get this dehydrating. So you can see it's got a fairly light color. That's because it's mostly pear. I did put a little bit of raspberry in here, giving it kind of a pink color. So I'm just gonna scoop out about 1.5 cups per tray. You know what? I think we actually need a little bit more. I'm gonna put another 1/2 cup on this tray here. These trays are wanting to curl up a little bit on the corner, so it may not get all the way to the corner. But I really like how convenient these dehydrator trays are, and it's really easy to peel the fruit leather off when you're done. But I will say there is an advantage to the parchment paper too, which is that you can keep your fruit leather right on the parchment paper and roll it up, and it gives it kind of its own wrapper. So as you can see, I spilled a little bit of fruit leather here. I'm gonna clean that up, and I'm gonna get this tray in the dehydrator. So you can see it is pretty watery right now. Remember, we did add the water to it to get it to incorporate. So that will obviously all evaporate as it dehydrates. So I'll let you know how I like it with the 2 cups of fruit leather as opposed to the 1.5. I think it's probably gonna be good. It might need to dehydrate a little bit longer this way though. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna make this one with only 1.5 cups. That way I can give you guys a real comparison. I usually use 1.5 cups per tray, but for some reason this time that just didn't seem like enough, so I added an extra 1/2 cup. But this way, I'll make one both ways, and then I can let you guys know for sure. Okay, so now for our parchment paper tray, I think that this should be enough. I'm just gonna go ahead and pour the rest of our fruit leather right onto this parchment paper here. So I doubled the recipe. Could probably even get away with tripling it with the size of the dehydrator that I have. So I may end up doing that. All right, let's get this last one loaded in and get it. So I'm going to run this dehydrator on 122 degrees. The recipe actually calls for 125. My dehydrator doesn't have that setting, so 122 is the closest that it has. The recipe says between 10 to 12 hours. I'm going to start it for, I think, 12 hours, especially because I made it a little bit thicker, so it may not be done. So it's going to run overnight, and then in the morning it'll finish. So I'm gonna meet you back here in the morning to show you the final product. So it's the next day. I just wanted to show you how our pear raspberry fruit leather turned out and also how our frozen pears turned out. So let's go on over to the dehydrator. I'll pull out the fruit leather and I'll show you what it looks like. Now I did run it for 12 hours last night. This morning it wasn't quite done, so I ran it for about 4 more hours this morning. I think it's done now, but we're gonna pull it out and take a look. The recipe said to put a cup of fruit leather on each tray here, and we did a cup and a half on one of them and actually 2 cups on some of the others. So I think that's the reason for it taking a little bit longer. So I'm just going to show you how thin this comes out. Just going to kind of want to very carefully peel this off. It is very thin, as you know, fruit leather generally is. But now remember, I think this is the tray that we used 1.5 cups on. You can see how thin this is, and it's even thinner when you only use 1. So I really think that using 2 is a better choice. So you can see these little holes here are when I tested it thinking it was done and it wasn't. It was still liquidy. But so you can see how this comes out. I'm just going to take off a little bit and give it a try. That is good. Has a good flavor. It's a good texture. I think if we did it any thinner, it would have been too thin. So I would definitely recommend, if your tray is about this size, this is the size tray that I have here. If it's about that size, I would do 1.5 or 2 cups of fruit leather per tray. I would not do 1. I think that's not enough. So let's take a look at our other trays. I'm going to see if I can find the one that has 2 cups on it to compare for you. So this one, I don't know if you can tell in the camera, this one looks a little bit thicker to me. So let's take a look at this one and see how it compares. So we'll try to kind of peel this off. Still pretty thin, but this is definitely the thicker one. Just judging by feel, I think I might like this 2 cup one better. Let's take a little bit off and try this one too. That's good. I think you could go either way. I think 1.5 or 2 cups per tray is fine. Maybe I lean towards 2 cups, but I think either one is fine. So this is done. This is a success. So I'm just going to get this cut into strips and I'm going to put it in a freezer bag to preserve it. It doesn't need to actually be kept in the freezer, but I just like to keep it in a freezer bag because it's more airtight than just a regular Ziploc bag. Now, if you made your fruit leather on parchment paper like this, you just kind of roll up the paper like this, cut it into strips and store it on there. Sort of like the classic fruit roll up, and then just peel it off as you eat it. For the ones on the tray here, I think I'm just going to cut it into strips and put it in the bag just how it is. And we'll hope that they don't stick together too much. And this will just make a great snack for my kids. Now this will probably be a little bit sticky as you store it. You may want to separate it with layers of either parchment paper or wax paper. It probably depends on how fast you're going to go through it and just your preference. So now before we go, I just want to take a look at the first batch of pears that we froze together yesterday and see how those came out now that they should be frozen solid. And I also wanted to give you my thoughts on the 2 recipes of pear butter. Now I know I said I was going to tell you my favorite, but they're so different that I don't think I can really choose. I think they're just so different that I can't really compare them. The one from the Ball Preserving book, the lighter colored one, it was just lighter tasting, it was citrusy, it was very bright tasting. So that was really good when you just want that type of flavor. The other one was deeper, it was more spiced, it was more caramelly. So they're just both really good and it's really hard to choose. Maybe kind of as the season goes on and I try them in different ways, I might have a more definite opinion to share with you. But for now, I would say that they're both worth trying. And it kind of depends on your preference. Or if you want some variety, then go ahead and make both. Now, let's go ahead and pull our pears out of the freezer and see how they froze. So these are the pears that we froze together yesterday. They've frozen really well. They're frozen solid now, not stuck together at all. That's the benefit of freezing them on a cookie sheet like this where they're spread out. As you can see, at this point, there isn't any discoloration. So as time goes on, I will pay attention to the color and I'll let you know how they hold up over time. In the winter, I'll probably be making some smoothies with these or doing water kefir or flavoring water kefir with them. As an aside, I mentioned water kefir yesterday just kind of casually when we were talking about freezing the pears. Now, if you're not familiar with water kefir, it's a really easy and delicious probiotic drink. It's great for your gut health and just your overall digestive health. Really, really easy to make at home. I'm going to be doing a video on that sometime this fall. I'm not sure exactly when. So for now, let's go ahead and get these pears bagged. So I'm just going to transfer all these frozen pears to this freezer bag. Now that they're all frozen solid, I don't have to worry about them sticking together. they'll stay pretty independent of each other, and that way I can just pull out only what I need just for a certain day. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me yesterday and today while we preserved up lots of pears. We had 20 pounds of organic pears, and I'll show you what we have left. We have just a few left in the bottom of our box here. So those are going to be either another round of frozen pears or another thing of fruit leather. I think I might actually have enough to do one more tray of frozen pears and one more recipe of fruit leather as well. So I think that's what's going to happen with the rest of these. But thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I just really love preserving food this time of year. I know I don't always have the best attitude about winter. It's really hard for me when it's cold and dark and nothing's growing outside and there isn't a lot of fresh food. And preserving up the summer and fall bounty really helps me go into winter just knowing that it won't be that bad, that I'll have a little bit of a taste of summer still. So I hope you guys enjoyed hanging out with me and preserving with me. I hope that you are inspired to try preserving some of your own food. And if you have any other great recipes for preserving pears, go ahead and leave them in the comments because I would love to get more ideas for next year. All right, so I hope you guys are having a great day. I hope you're getting ready for winter by preserving the harvest from summer and fall. And I hope to see you again soon. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye guys. See you next time.